Hi, I'm Angus Kress Gillespie, your host for East Brunswick Television. Dr. Maria Kennedy is a folklore instructor in the Department of American Studies at Rutgers University. She's also the administrative director of the New Jersey Folk Festival. Maria received her PhD from Indiana University's Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology in 2017. Her dissertation, Finding Lost Fruit, the Cider Poetic, Orchard Conservation, and Craft Cider Making in Britain, examined the production of cider in rural England. She continues her research in the craft cider revival in North America. She came here to New Jersey from the Southern Finger Lakes region of New York State, where she directed the Old Time Fiddlers Gathering and Folk Arts Festival. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kennedy to our studio today. So Maria, I understand you've recently taken a job with the American Studies Department at Rutgers. Tell us a little bit about that job.
So I'm going to be taking over as the managing director of the New Jersey Folk Festival, and I'll be teaching folklore classes in the American Studies Department.
Oh, okay. How did you happen to choose the folklore profession?
Well, that was actually a series of fortunate accidents. I went to graduate school to study journalism. I thought I would become a professional journalist. I liked writing about people and culture, and I ended up at the Indiana University School of Journalism. Indiana University also happens to be the home of one of the very few folklore departments in North America. And I just happened to be lucky enough that my journalism advisor sat down with me and talked with me for about 10 minutes and said, I think you're a folklorist. You need to go take this class in the folklore department with a professor named Glassy, and I think you're gonna like it. And I wasn't convinced at first. I thought that, I was like, well, whatever, you know, I don't know. But he said, just try it out, go for one class and see what you think. And that class literally changed my life. It was a really compelling lecture. I don't remember the exact topic. I just remember I had never heard anyone talk about culture and the different ways that people used art in their communities, quite like this professor, Henry Glassy, did. So I ended up taking more courses in the folklore department, ended up graduating with both a journalism degree and a folklore degree. And then I just liked it so much, I continued with my PhD. And here I am today. Along the way, I worked for an organization called Traditional Arts Indiana, which, like the program here at Rutgers, was housed in the university, but offered students an opportunity to go work in the community in a nonprofit situation, looking at folk arts in the community.
Yeah. Well, it is true that in the folklore profession, Henry Glassy is something of a legend.
Yes, but I didn't even know that at the time. The name meant nothing to me. I just ended up in his class, and it was a really transformative experience.
Yeah, I remember hearing a story that when he was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, his professors said, they were talking about a dissertation in general terms. He said, well why don't you write a preliminary bibliography? And he did, and it was quite substantial. And when he turned it in, the professor said, well, this is a dissertation.
I think there are some scholars who are just so charismatic. They know how to turn what might be otherwise esoteric and not that interesting, things that aren't that interesting to the everyday person, into something that's really exciting and meaningful. And he was one of those kinds of professors for me and for the field at large, too.
Yeah, he's not only a solid scholar, but he's a persuasive speaker.
Yes.
Yeah. Charismatic, I think, was the word you used. So how does this position at Rutgers fit in with your overall career goals?
Well, that's such a good question. I'm not sure I know what the end of the rainbow is, but I've always loved working in the public sector. I really love my scholarship. I love being able to talk with people about really specific things, about really in-depth studies of art and culture. But I also really like being able to talk to the public and to present things in a way that are really in-depth, but also accessible to everybody, not just scholars in the university.
Yeah.
So I've always wanted to chart a path that allowed me to do both of those things. And this position at Rutgers really has made that possible for me.
A follow-up question, you use the term public sector folklore. What is public sector folklore?
Well, one of the really interesting things about the field of folklore, which a lot of people haven't heard of, you went to college and you studied English or history. Not so many people get the chance to learn about folklore. But in this little field in the university, people have really focused on taking the opportunity to work with people in public libraries like this one, through nonprofit organizations. The biggest organizations like this in the country are the Smithsonian and the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. So there are people working in the field of folklore to understand communities and their cultures, both at the very local level in libraries and museums, and also at the national level in some of our greatest American institutions.
So these public sector folklorists, they have academic training, but they're not necessarily in a university setting.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's a really wonderful example of how much the scholarly study in the university can then go out and serve the country through its other public and nonprofit institutions.
What are some of your favorite classes to teach?
Well, in the class I'm teaching right now, which is called American Folklore, there's one lecture that I really enjoy giving, and that's a lecture on alien abduction narratives. And you might say, what? Alien abduction narratives? But I teach this in the context of a whole series of lectures on narrative and the study of how people create stories and share them. And I have a lecture on fairy tales, and then we sort of move a little further in the future and talk about urban legends. And then we talk about alien abduction narratives, because they're just a really particularly American form of the fairy tale in a way, and the urban legend, having to do with the excitement that we have about space and exploration, but also the fears we have about the role of government in society and the way that technology is changing the way we think of ourselves as humans. And then after that, we move on to some more supernatural belief narratives and folk religion. So it really fits in a whole series of interesting ways of thinking about the way Americans talk about and create stories about their own lives and their experiences in America.
So if I hear you correctly, I think what you're saying is you as a scholar, when you're dealing with alien abductions, you don't try to make a determination whether those stories are true or false. You try to say whether they're believed or not believed. Am I onto something there?
Yeah, I think so. That's one of the things I think about. The other thing I like to think about is, how do these stories people tell about aliens have something to do with the rest of the social issues that are happening in our country today? Sometimes my students and I will talk about the way that people talk about abduction and aliens in a sort of supernatural framework or a fantastic framework.
A science fiction.
A science fiction framework can also tell us something about how people feel about their own bodies and the way that health and health care works today in the context of technologies that we don't even understand.
Or maybe even about immigration.
Exactly, yeah.
Is this person an alien, or is this an undocumented worker?
Exactly. There's so many ways that we are able to talk about the things that frighten us or that are outside of our everyday experience that might seem inconsequential or strange, like alien abduction narratives, but they're ways that people have to talk about things that they don't know how to talk about in another way.
Within the realm of folklore, what's your favorite book?
So my favorite book is called Fire in the Plaza by Dorothy Noyes. And this is a scholarly book, so there's a lot in it that's, you know, pretty obtuse and esoteric for the average reader, but there's also some beautiful passages about the festival that happens in Catalonia that this scholar went to study.
It's called Fire where?
Fire in the Plaza, and this study takes place in Spain, and it's about a festival where there are these huge puppets that get paraded through the streets, and there are big fires. It's a very evocative festival. And this particular scholar had a way of writing about that I thought was both really interesting intellectually, but really beautiful, and it made you be able to see and imagine this place that probably I won't ever get to visit.
Yeah. Perhaps you end up assigning that in one of your courses at Rutgers.
Maybe.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about your graduate work at Indiana, other than your relationship with Henry Glassy.
So before I went to graduate school and had my, introduction to my accidental introduction into folklore, I spent a couple of summers working on farms in England through a work exchange experience called Worldwide Opportunities on Organic Farms. And that was another thing that really changed my life. And I ended up going back to that experience again and again in my research. And I ended up researching cider and orchard conservation in England, which is a little bit hard to explain, but in England, people have such a different relationship with their countryside. It's so old, it's been managed for hundreds or even thousands of years. There isn't much wilderness. And so when people think about wildlife conservation in England, they have to think about something else other than an idea of wilderness, because wilderness doesn't really exist there the way it does here. So they turn to agriculture as a way of doing conservation work. So I was looking at both how people do environmental conservation on agricultural land, but also how that intersects with folk customs and agricultural traditions that have a long-standing impact on those communities, and how those things work together.
And whereabouts in England did all this take place?
So I was in the county of Herefordshire, which is on the west part of England. It's right on the border with Wales. It's very rural, and it happens to be a county where there has traditionally been a lot of apple orchards and cider making.
Also, I understand that you went to school in Canada. What was that like?
So I was actually born in Canada.
Oh.
I am secretly Canadian. And I was born in Montreal. And I ended up, when I was thinking about going to college, I thought, well, why not consider Canada? And it ended up being a really financially smart decision because tuition is much lower there. So I went to McGill University in Montreal, and it was a really interesting experience. Even though I had Canadian relatives and had visited a few times while I was growing up.
You grew up in Indiana.
I grew up in the United States in Indiana, but I had never really spent time in a big metropolitan city. And I hadn't really spent time in another country, living in another country. And even though it's really close, and most people speak English in Montreal, even though it's a French-speaking city, very different political situation there. So I really learned a lot about not only the things you learn in college and the life lessons you learn about growing up, but about thinking about the world from this perspective of living in a different country.
Did you pick up French while you were there?
I can get around, but I really couldn't hold a conversation very well.
And then later on, you did work in the Southern Finger Lakes with the Arts Council. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I got a job as the folk arts coordinator at the Arts Council of the Southern Finger Lakes, which is in Corning, New York. It's only about 4 hours north of here, although it's a world away in terms of the amount of snow.
Sort of Binghamton and beyond.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I managed a festival there, the Old Time Fiddlers Gathering, and I did numerous other projects with some of the cultural communities in that area.
And as I recall, you worked with African American communities in that festival?
One of the first projects that I got to do when I was at the Arts Council was I actually took over a project from the outgoing folk arts coordinator about Black history in the city of Corning. And Corning is a very small place, and it has a very small African American community. But
So mainly for glass, right?
yeah, it's the town is very well known for Corning glass.
Yeah.
And actually, many of the African American community had come up during the Great Migration to work in the glass factories.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting introduction into the issues that the African American community had endured over their residence in the city, and many times when they had experienced discrimination, but also the people who had really pushed for civil rights and had moved that community forward and negotiated with other residents in the city for better understanding.
And you also work with the Jewish community up there?
Yes, and in fact, the last project that I did at the Arts Council before coming here was to put on an exhibit about Jewish culture in the city of Elmira, New York, which is just down the road from Corning. And we are closing that exhibit at the end of this month with a guest lecture by the cookbook author Joan Nathan, who has written a number of cookbooks and has had her own TV show about Jewish cooking in America.
And if I'm not mistaken, Elmira, there's the National Museum for Women's Rights in Elmira. Am I got that?
That's in Seneca Falls.
Oh, that's Seneca Falls. Okay. Yeah.
Not too far away,
I get them mixed up.
That's
yeah.
at the top of the Finger Lakes.
Yeah.
This is at the bottom.
Yeah. And then you also work with Finnish communities.
Yes, one of the most unexpected communities that I encountered in the Finger Lakes was a Finnish American community. They had an interesting history.
Yeah, who knew?
Who knew, exactly. They had actually come to the Finger Lakes via the upper Midwest. A lot of the families had originally come to the upper Midwest to work in forestry and mining. And then there was a concerted effort to convince Finnish families to migrate to the area around Ithaca, New York, because there was all this abandoned farmland around Ithaca. And they wanted some hardy Northern Europeans who could tackle these upland hill farms around Ithaca and who weren't going to be scared off by the snow. So they advertised in the Finnish newspapers in the upper Midwest, cheap land available, come, and they did.
Wow.
One family followed another, and soon a whole Finnish community started being built up there at the beginning of the 20th century. And they're still there. They still speak Finnish. The Finger Lakes Finns are an active community. And I got to work with a musician named Richard Koski, who plays the accordion and is carrying on the tradition of the Finnish dance halls of his youth.
Wow. And finally, you work with the Muslim community.
A little bit. That was actually a really humbling learning experience. A lot of times, you want to reach out and work with the communities who might be the most vulnerable and see if you can find ways to bridge the gaps that might exist in our society today. And we reached out and we had a number of dialogues to see if there might be ways to work together. And in the end, I think that we would have liked to move forward, but there were some impediments. I think the Muslim community was a little bit worried about putting themselves out into the limelight. And so we didn't move forward with any immediate projects. Then I took this job and left. So I hope that there is opportunity for the organization up there to work more with the Muslim community.
Yeah.
But it showed me that you really need to consider, what are the best ways to work with a community that is under stress.
Yeah, it's not always easy.
Yeah.
Speaking of not always easy, what do you see as the major challenges with your new position at Rutgers?
It's a great question. I think that one of the things I'd really like to do this year as I am coming in is to meet with as many of the people I can on the board and in the staff, and also alumni and students, to understand what they think the festival does best, but also what they think the festival doesn't do so well, so that we can see what directions we can grow in that are already core missions and values of the festival, and maybe see if there are other areas that we could maybe trim off or let go. And I want to understand what stake all these folks have in the festival, so that we can really make sure that we're doing the best version of the festival that we can going forward.
So you plan to do a lot of listening?
A lot of listening, yes. I'll go on a listening tour this year.
Tell us a little bit more about your PhD dissertation on the cider making in Britain.
That was a truly delightful experience. I got to live in England for about a year and a half, and I worked on a cider farm. I originally thought I would be studying organic farming, but I just happened to be in this region where there were orchards and lots of people making craft cider. There was a revival going on. And everywhere I went in the autumn, there were signs for, harvest festivals, cider festivals, let's, preserve our orchard landscapes. And I just thought this was so interesting and clearly compelling to the people in this community. So I decided to look more into that. I ended up working on a cider farm, talking to a lot of other cider makers and farmers about why this particular craft was important to the community, how it had been revived, and how they were implementing environmental conservation in the practice of their farming today.
And you mentioned festival. There's this wassailing festival. Am I saying it right?
You can say wassail, that happens on the 12th night of Christmas.
Oh.
And the wassail is an opportunity for you to go out and bless the trees. There are various interpretations of what it means and how it happens, but I think the fluidity of that gives people a lot of room to sort of do whatever they think is most enjoyable or fun. But generally speaking, you go out into the orchard on the 12th night of Christmas, and you sing to the trees. You give them a little drink. You pour some cider onto the roots of the tree and put some toast in the branches for the birds to eat. And you ask the spirits or what have you to give you a good harvest next year. And there are a lot of reasons that people do this. I think obviously not many people really believe in the spirits, aspect of it anymore. I think at one time it was a way for landowners and agricultural workers to figure out a way to get along better for the coming year. And today I think it really gives people who don't have a lot of access to or experience with agriculture in our urbanized world an opportunity to kind of have a homecoming to the farm, because a lot of people still want to have a connection to rural life, even if they don't actively farm or don't have a regular way of being part of agricultural living. So it's an opportunity for both city folks and country folks to sort of reassess and enjoy and celebrate their agricultural heritage.
Yeah, in a way, I'm not surprised. I understand in the U.S., for example, some families have a farm vacation where they can go to a working farm and help out.
Yeah, agritourism is a hugely growing sector of the tourism industry worldwide. And I think understanding why people are interested in farms, even if they don't live on or work on farms, is a really important part of our food security going forward.
What's the difference between cider and beer?
Cider is made from apples, and beer is made from grain.
Okay.
So when you think of cider, they're both fermented. They both use yeast to turn the sugars that are in either the apple juice or the grain, the sugars that are extracted from grain, the malt, into alcohol. But cider is kind of more like wine than it is like beer in the way that it's made, because you harvest the apples in the fall, just like you would harvest the grapes. Then you take the juice and you let it ferment into alcohol. Whereas beer, you take grain, you can do it any time of year. You know, you've got the grain, it's harvested, but then it's stored, and you can make it sort of as an ongoing
so the
activity.
cider is seasonal.
Cider is very seasonal, yeah.
And can you make cider out of pears?
You definitely can. And in fact, one of the things I would love to do if I go back to England to do more research is to research this very small area where making perry, as it's called, or pear cider, is a long-standing tradition.
Huh.
There are trees that are still alive that were planted in the reign of Queen Anne for making perry.
Other fruits other than
I mean, you can ferment anything. So
yeah.
just depends what the traditions are and what your taste is. There are certain purists who think that cider and perry should only be made with cider or pears.
Yeah, yeah.
But, you know, other people are a little more inventive.
And are, just shooting from the hip, any differences between the ciders in England and New England?
Definitely. One of the reasons is the apples that you grow.
Okay.
Certain apples are used in England and in France and Spain. There are thousands of different apple varieties.
Of course, okay.
And the apple varieties that we use here in the United States, there were historically varieties that were used more for making cider. A lot of cider today is made using apples that were originally grown for eating. And they're quite different than the apples you would grow to make cider. The apples you would grow to make cider are more tannic. They have tannins, just like grape has tannins in it for wine. And they have more sugar so that you can ferment more from them.
That's very interesting. So, can you make cider at home?
Definitely. I highly encourage anyone who has an interest to go get yourself some freshly pressed juice from your local, apple farm or cider presser, and get yourself some equipment. All you need is a barrel and some yeast, and just see what happens.
Do you prefer still or bubbly?
I think it depends on the occasion. I like both.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy a still cider, especially on a cold winter evening.
So you're relatively starting out in a career. So far, what has been your greatest achievement?
I think the thing that I was most proud of in the past year, at least, was a project I did in the Finger Lakes that brought together glass blowers and cider makers. I thought to myself, we have these two regional specialties, and why don't we bring them together? So we paired up some glass artists and some cider makers to make custom glassware for each cider maker. And one of the questions we asked was, how can the glass makers make works of art that reflect the aesthetics of each different cider business? But also, can they make a vessel that helps us taste each individual cider and experience its culinary or beverage qualities to the most extent that we can? And it was very interesting exercise because we had a bubbly cider and a still cider, and we found that different shapes of glasses helped people enjoy different kinds of drinks. And that's what I was most proud of.
Yeah.
I thought, I helped create this opportunity for people to be creative together.
I think your pride is justified. Well, Marie, I want to thank you for coming to East Brunswick today and sharing your background with us, and we wish you all the luck with your career at Rutgers.
Thank you so much, Angus. It's been a pleasure.